December 26, 1944. A frozen field outside the Belgian hamlet of Foy, just northeast of the shattered town of Bastogne. The sound is the first thing that defines the moment. Not the sharp, concussive blasts of artillery. That hellish orchestra has, for now, moved west. This is a low, guttural, rumbling chorus. The diesel engines of American deuce-and-a-half trucks, dozens of them, grinding through the icy muck of the Ardennes forest. They form a rough, imposing circle in the white-scarred field, like a wagon train from some grim industrial frontier. Inside that circle sit over 1,000 men. They are the remnants of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division and the Panzerlehr. Hours before, they were soldiers of the Third Reich, part of the last desperate lunge through the Allied lines, the Battle of the Bulge. Now, they are prisoners of war. Their uniforms are dirty white from a week spent hiding in snowdrifts. Their faces gaunt with a hunger that 5 days of constant combat and retreat has etched into their bones. They huddle together not for warmth, there is none to be found, but because the sheer mass of their numbers is the only thing left that makes sense. The cold is a physical entity. It seeps up from the frozen earth. It slices through worn-wool greatcoats. It crystallizes on unshaven faces. You can see it in the clouds of breath that hang above the huddled masses. A low, desperate fog. The men stare, eyes hollow, at their captors. The American GIs, just boys many of them, stand on the perimeter. They look exhausted to their very souls. Their own faces pinched and pale under their steel pots. They clutch their M1 Garens, not with aggression, but with a numb vigilance. The air is thick with a silence that is more than the absence of gunfire. It is the silence of utter depletion, of two armies brought to the very brink of their endurance, now forced into this fragile, frozen tableau. A German Oberleutnant, his shoulder boards torn and filthy, watches an American sergeant light a cigarette with trembling, chapped hands. The German's own pockets are empty. He remembers the promises, the briefings before the offensive. We will strike through the Ardennes, split the Allied armies, and seize the port of Antwerp. They are weak. They are unprepared. He looks at the ring of trucks, the watchful eyes of the GIs, the vast, gray sky that has finally cleared to allow the relentless Allied fighter-bombers, the J-bows, to return. He feels the hollow ache in his stomach. None of those promises matter now. Only survival does. Then, a murmur ripples through the German prisoners. A shift. They watch as the American soldiers, on order from their officers, begin to move. But they are not raising their rifles. They are walking toward the trucks. From the backs of the vehicles, the Americans begin to haul out crates. Not crates of ammunition. These are darker and heavier. The GIs pry them open with bayonets. The sound of splintering would cracking across the silent field. And then, they start pulling out small, rectangular, dark brown bricks. They are wrapped in waxed paper. The Americans carry armfuls of them, walking from their perimeter and stepping into the circle of prisoners. The German prisoners tense. Instincts honed by years of war and Nazi propaganda scream a warning. This is a trick. A humiliation. What could this be? The Oberleutnant's mind, dulled by cold, races through possibilities. Poison? Some strange new explosive? The men around him shrink back slightly, a wave of unease moving through the crowd like a chill wind. An American corporal, his face looking older than his years, stops in front of a cluster of young German soldiers. They can't be more than 18. He doesn't speak German. He doesn't need to. He simply holds out one of the brown bricks. He makes a braking motion, then points to his own mouth. His eyes hold no malice, only a flat, profound exhaustion. Tentatively, one of the German boys reaches out. His fingers, numb and blue, close around the brick. It is heavy, dense. He tears the waxed paper. The smell hits him first, rich, sweet, deep. It is a smell utterly alien to this frozen battlefield of cordite, blood, and damp earth. It is the smell of chocolate. He stares at it. It is a U.S. Army field ration D-bar. High-calorie, emergency sustenance, designed to withstand any climate. To the American GIs, it was a last-resort food, notorious for its chalky texture and bland, stubborn sweetness. But to this German soldier, whose last proper meal was a week ago in a Hitler Youth canteen now 100 miles behind enemy lines, it is an artifact from another world. A world of plenty. A world that still has chocolate. He takes a small bite. The hard bar barely yields. But then the flavor spreads, the sugar, the cocoa fat. It is an electric shock to his system. He looks up at the American corporal, his eyes wide with a confusion that borders on fear. Why? Why would they give this to him? All across the field, the scene repeats. American soldiers moving methodically, silently, distributing the deration bars to their prisoners. No speeches, no ceremony, just the simple, staggering act of handing food to the men who, just hours before, were trying to kill them. The Oberleutnant receives his bar from a lieutenant. Their eyes meet for a second. The American's gaze is unreadable, etched with the same fatigue that crushes everyone here. The German officer, trained to see his enemies as monstrous or decadent or weak, finds none of those things in that look. He finds only a shared human wreckage. He eats. The chocolate is bittersweet, gritty. It is the most magnificent thing he has ever tasted. And as the sugar hits his bloodstream, a new, more terrifying thought begins to dawn, cutting through the numbness of captivity. This was not from a supply dump meant for prisoners. These rations came from the Americans' own trucks, from their precious, precarious supply lines stretched across the frozen Ardennes. They were giving away their own food. The chocolate was not an isolated act. It was the first crack in a dam. As the initial shock of the ration bars subsided, replaced by the mechanical act of chewing and swallowing, the American GIs continued to work. Now they were bringing out more crates and cans. Not in great abundance, but in a steady, deliberate distribution. Cans of meat and vegetable stew, tins of crackers, packets of soluble coffee. These were K-rations, the individual daily meals of the American soldier. The prisoners accepted them with mute, trembling hands. The ritual was the same. The American would offer, the German would take. Their eyes would meet in that wordless, exhausted exchange. For the Germans, this was a logic that defied their entire frame of reference. The propaganda films of Die Deutsche Wochenschau flashed in their minds. Images of the decadent, soft Americans, the Amos, drowning in luxury while the German soldier endured with iron will. They had been told the Americans were weak, that they would break under the pressure of a real blitzkrieg. Yet here those same Americans were, standing in the same freezing hell, having just stopped the German advance cold. And they were sharing their rations. An older German Feldwebel, a sergeant with a grizzled face and the Iron Cross First Class pinned to his tunic, watched the process with a mounting, clinical disbelief. He had fought in Russia. He knew what happened to prisoners there on both sides. He knew the primal arithmetic of scarcity. When supplies are short, you feed your own first. Always, you hoard. You let the captive starve if you must. It was a brutal, unspoken law of survival. This act by the Americans wasn't just kindness. It was a violation of that fundamental law. It felt dangerously naive or impossibly confident. His eyes scanned the American perimeter. He counted the trucks again. He studied the faces of the GIs. They weren't looking at the prisoners with pity, nor with hatred. They looked resigned. And then he understood. This wasn't charity. It was logistics, a cold, practical calculation. These thousands of prisoners were now the responsibility of the U.S. Army. Let them starve here and they would become a mob. They would die in droves, creating a humanitarian disaster and a disease risk that would cripple the American advance. Feeding them, even with your own food, was the only way to maintain control, to move them back to the rear, to process them. It was, the Feldwebel realized, an act of supreme military efficiency. But that realization, cold as it was, could not account for what happened next. It started with a single GI, a young man who might have been a farm boy from Iowa or Kansas. He was standing guard, stomping his feet to keep the blood flowing. From his coat pocket, he pulled out a small, soft-pack Chesterfield cigarettes. He lit one for himself, taking a long, deep drag that seemed to warm his entire body for a brief moment. Then, his eyes fell on the German prisoner closest to him, a shivering boy who was trying futilely to open his can of stew with numb fingers. The American hesitated. He looked at his half-full pack. A cigarette was currency. It was a tiny piece of comfort, a minute-long escape. He glanced around, as if checking if an officer was watching. Then he stepped forward. He didn't throw the pack. He walked over and simply held it out. The German boy stared, first at the American, then at the offered cigarettes. Slowly, he took one. The American produced a lighter, flicked it, and held the flame out. The German leaned in, cupping his hands around the American's to shield the wind. For a second, their hands touched. The German inhaled, coughed slightly, then nodded. "Danke," he whispered. It was a breach, not of the perimeter, but of the intangible wall that was supposed to exist between conqueror and conquered. Like a spark jumping a gap, the gesture spread. Another American offered a matchbook to a prisoner trying to light a damp cigarette, but he'd saved. A GI handed over a worn pair of wool gloves to a German whose hands were visibly cracked and blue. There was no coordinated order for this. It was individual, instinctive, and it moved through the frozen field like a low current. The Feldwebel watched, his theory of cold logistics beginning to fray at the edges. You did not give your enemy your gloves to maintain control. You did not share your personal cigarettes for efficiency. This was something else. It was a recognition, man to man, of the sheer, awful misery of their shared circumstance. The Americans, he saw now, were not just well supplied. They were connected to that supply in a way he could barely comprehend. Their abundance was not just material. It was psychological. They could afford this small generosity because, somewhere far behind their lines, there were factories, ships, trains, an endless river of things that would replace what they gave away. It was a display of power more devastating than any artillery barrage. It whispered, "We have so much, we can afford to give some to you." And in that whisper, the last vestiges of the Nazi myth, the myth of the superior German soldier thriving on will alone, crumbled to dust in the Belgian cold. The prisoners weren't just eating American food. They were consuming a terrifying new reality. But the most profound shock, the one that would sear itself into their memories for decades, was still to come. It would arrive not from a crate or a pocket, but from the sky. It began as a distant, familiar thrum, a sound that had meant death for weeks. The German prisoners flinched as one, their heads snapping upward, eyes scanning the bruised gray sky. The Jabos, the memory of screaming dive bombers and strafing fighter planes, was a fresh wound in every mind. Instinctively, men crouched lower, as if trying to press themselves into the frozen earth. The American guards, too, looked wary, tightening their grips on their rifles, searching the clouds. But the sound didn't sharpen into the high-pitched scream of a diving P-47 Thunderbolt. It deepened, multiplied, becoming a heavy, rhythmic drone. From the western horizon, they emerged not as sleek, predatory shapes, but as slow, steady, enormous forms. A formation of C-47 Skytrans, the workhorse cargo planes of the Allies, their twin engines laboring under immense weight. Confusion replaced fear on the field. The Feldwebel squinted. These were not bombers. They were transports. But why here? This pocket around Bastogne had been relieved only days ago. The perimeter was secure. Were they bringing in reinforcements? More supplies for the American spearheads pushing east? The planes grew closer, lower. They were not passing overhead. They were circling them. The giant circle of trucks and men in the field became a focal point. And then, the backs of the planes opened like gaping mouths. Not paratroopers. Objects tumbled out, large and dark, plunging toward the earth. A collective gasp, a ducking of heads. But there was no whistle of bombs. Instead, blossoming above the falling shapes were canopies of white silk. Parachutes, dozens of them. A slow, beautiful, silent snowfall of supplies descending upon the frozen prison yard. The first heavy pallet thudded into the earth 100 yards away, its parachute collapsing like a dying lily. American soldiers rushed toward it, using their bayonets and knives to cut the cords and webbing. The crates inside were not marked with artillery shell stencils or military codes for ammunition. They were marked with stark, simple letters, U.S. Army Field Ration, Type B, and another, even more unbelievable, medical supplies, POW. The Oberleutnant from the first morning watched, his mouth slightly agape. He had seen German supply planes attempt airdrops at Stalingrad. The pallets that fell there contained a pittance of ammunition and hard bread, and half of them landed in Soviet hands. This was of a different magnitude entirely. This was a systematic, planned, massive resupply operation. And it was for prisoners. Now the American GIs worked with a new urgency, but not the urgency of men securing weapons. They were dragging crates of canned fruit, powdered eggs, Real bread, and actual blankets toward the center of the circle. They broke open a medical crate, and German prisoners with obvious wounds, men who had been tended to with only basic field dressings, were gently moved forward. American medics, their own supplies undoubtedly limited, began treating enemy soldiers with sulfa powder, proper bandages, and splints. The young German boy who had first tasted the ration bar stood trembling, not from cold now, but from a seismic shift in understanding. He watched an American medic carefully set the broken arm of a German corporal. He saw a GI hand a whole carton of cigarettes to a group of prisoners. He saw stacks of olive drab wool blankets being passed into the crowd. The sky, which for so long had been a source of terror, had just become a source of salvation. And the Americans on the ground were the ministers of this bizarre, inverted mercy. The Feldwebel's analytical mind finally short-circuited. Logistics, efficiency, this went beyond that. This was a staggering, profligate display of wealth. Not just material but moral. The United States was not just fighting the German army. It was demonstrating, in the most visceral way possible, that it possessed a bottomless capacity to care, even for its defeated enemies. The message was no longer a whisper. It was a shout from the heavens. Our humanity is as limitless as our industry. For many of the German prisoners, particularly the young ones indoctrinated since the Hitler Youth, this was the moment the war truly ended. The ideological fortress of the Third Reich, built on notions of racial superiority and destined victory, could not withstand this simple, observable fact. The enemy they had been taught to despise was feeding them, healing them, and clothing them from the sky. The shame of their defeat was now compounded by a bewildering, uncomfortable gratitude. As dusk began to bleed into the field, the prisoners sat on new blankets, eating stew heated on American field stoves, their wounded comrades resting more comfortably. The atmosphere had changed. The desperate tension was gone, replaced by a heavy, exhausted calm. But in the eyes of the German soldiers, a new kind of turmoil brewed. They were no longer just prisoners of war. They were prisoners of a profound, unsettling truth about the world that awaited them after the Reich's inevitable collapse. They had been conquered not by monsters, but by men who could afford to be kind. And in that kindness, they saw the terrifying, awesome shape of their own future. The train screeches to a halt under a blazing Texas sun, late June 1943. Dust swirls as the doors slide open, revealing Camp Hearn. Rows of neat white barracks framed by double fences topped with barbed wire, watchtowers rising like sentries against the endless flat horizon. Carl Becker steps down onto American soil again, this time far from any ocean, the air thick with the scent of pine and cattle. Hundreds of prisoners spill out, blinking in the light, expecting the worst. Forced labor under the lash, starvation rations, maybe even the brutal re-education whispered about in the hold. Instead, a U.S. Army captain in starched khakis addresses them through an interpreter, voice calm and matter-of-fact. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Work is voluntary and paid. No one will beat you. Food will be the same quality and quantity as our own soldiers receive. A ripple of disbelief passes through the ranks. Geneva Convention? The Reich had sneered at it on the Eastern Front, yet here the enemy quotes it like scripture. You can picture the scene. Lines forming for assignment, barracks divided by rank, officers separated as required. Becker finds himself in a long wooden hut with tiered bunks, real mattresses, pillows, even sheets. A pot-bellied stove sits ready for winter, though now it's sweltering. Each man gets a footlocker, toiletries, towels. Showers with hot water run day and night. The latrines flush. Flush. Some prisoners laugh out loud the first time they pull the chain, the sound echoing like a small rebellion against everything they'd endured. Then comes the canteen. Not a punishment detail, but an actual store. Prisoners earn camp scrip, 40 cents a day for enlisted men, more for officers, through optional jobs. Farming, laundry, carpentry. With it they buy razor blades, toothpaste, beer, 3 bottles per week, real American lager, Coca-Cola, candy, even harmonicas and books. Becker stands in line his first day, clutching scrip earned from peeling potatoes, and purchases a cold bottle of Coke. The fizz hits his tongue like fireworks, ice-cold sweetness he hasn't tasted since before the war. Around him, hardened veterans of El Alamein and Tobruk sip the same drink, eyes wide like children. Meals arrive 3 times a day, served cafeteria style. Pork chops, fried chicken, spaghetti with meat sauce, corn on the cob dripping butter, peach cobbler for dessert. Portions unlimited, go back for seconds, thirds if you want. Becker watches a former Panzer ace pile his tray until it nearly buckles, then devour it all in stunned silence. Weight returns to hollow cheeks. Men who arrive skeletal now fill out their gray PW fatigues. The camp doctor weighs them weekly, prescribing extra milk and eggs for the worst cases. No one starves. No one. Evenings bring something stranger still, recreation. A soccer field carved from Texas dirt hosts fierce matches. Africa Corps veterans against guards or other camps. Cheers rise in German and English alike. The camp orchestra, formed from captured musicians, rehearses Beethoven and swing under the floodlights. Prisoners publish their own newspaper, Der Zonggast, the Fence Guest, filled with poetry, cartoons, even mild critiques of camp food. Too much. Some joke. Books arrive from the YMCA, Goethe, Schiller, but also Mark Twain and Jack London. A few request Mein Kampf out of habit. The librarian politely hands them Democracy in America instead. Lieutenant Voss, now in the officer's compound, clings hardest to suspicion. He gathers a circle of diehards, warning that the generosity is a trap, designed to break their spirit, make them grateful, turn them into traitors. Real soldiers endure hardship, he snaps. This softness will rot us. Yet even he accepts the new boots issued when his old ones fall apart, the dental work that fixes his aching molar without charge. Becker, though, begins to wander the camp at dusk, watching GIs and prisoners play volleyball over a makeshift net, trading cigarettes and jokes through the fence separating compounds. One guard, a lanky farm boy from Oklahoma named Corporal Hayes, teaches him English phrases over shared smokes. How about them Yankees? Hayes grins, pointing to a newspaper headline. Becker laughs, actually laughs, for the first time in years. But beneath the growing ease, a deeper unease stirs. Letters from home trickle in through the Red Cross. Bombed cities, bread rations cut again, children evacuated, wives queuing for hours for potatoes. Germany starves while its defeated sons feast on fried chicken and ice cream in enemy hands. The contrast gnaws at Becker like a splinter. If the Americans can feed 400,000 prisoners this well while fighting a global war, what does that say about the Reich's boasts of superiority? About the decadent plutocracy destined to collapse? One night, sitting on the barrack steps under a sky blazing with unfamiliar stars, Becker lights an American cigarette and stares at the barbed wire glinting in the moonlight. Freedom lies beyond it, yet for the first time he wonders if the real prison was the one he left behind.